Wow, I didn't expect anyone today. This is like the fifth Sunday of the month. This is the kind of the free Sunday you don't have to come. And here you are. Wow, this is great. We've been racing through Hebrews. We're nearing the finish line, just 43 verses to go. 4 messages in the month of August. Oh, maybe it's not that much of a race. We started in January, so that's kind of moving a little slowly. But then comes September, and we'll have finished the book, but we will definitely not have finished the race, because the race of faith will still go on, the race that Hebrews has started laying out for us so beautifully in the beginning of chapter 12. Let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. With endurance because it's a long haul, and with endurance because it's hard. It's full of obstacles. It's full of temptations. This race course is full of opposition and full of various kinds of pain. And some of you're early in the race, so let's just kind of get this racetrack up here, and then we'll get a picture of you, because let's say you're fresh to the race. You've been following Jesus for maybe a few days or weeks, and you're in the first mile, and your knees still feel good, and your feet aren't aching yet. I say yet because verse 3 of our chapter, we get the words weary and faint-hearted, a condition that comes all too commonly to those who have struggled with sin for a very long time. And it's sort of like hand-to-hand combat on the track with someone who's trying with all his might to knock you off the track or knock you into the wrong lane or disqualify you somehow. He wants to wear you out with soul fatigue and make you quit. And that's what this whole chapter is about. It's about fatigue, soul fatigue. And it's when you get mentally, morally, spiritually exhausted, even physically drained. I remember a few years ago when I had a list by my bed of 7 major trials. I don't know why I was going to write them all down, because I couldn't figure out why I was just so drained. And I wrote these down, and any one of them could have sent me into the fetal position or sent me to the phone to make an appointment with Earl. But frankly, I didn't see how I was going to make it through. I mean, I was bone weary and tired of wrestling with stuff, that some of which was out of my control, some of it wasn't, but it was way beyond my strength. That might be where you are right now. I think it's great how the messages in this chapter have fit each speaker so well. Nate led off with the race at the beginning of the chapter and used his experiences as a cross-country runner. I don't know if he was wearing his little yellow shorts or not, but we saw the pink pig costume, and it was great. He helped us understand what we face each day in the race of faith. And then last week, Michael drew on his life growing up on an orchard in eastern Washington to illustrate the difficult year-round process of trying to get trees to produce a crop, a good crop in August or September. And that was great. It fits so perfectly with the painful process that we go through to come to the point where we produce the peaceful fruit of righteousness, which is where we ended last week with that word righteousness, a life of peace and holiness that is a delight both to God and to us, like a juicy apple or a pear at the height of the harvest, or let's just say a peach. I like peach because they're so juicy. I love peaches. And I love apples. And you guys grew pears too? I love pears. Any other fruits you want to nominate? These are all good. And then we come to my passage today. Drooping hands and weak knees. And what could be a better fit? My knee on ice almost every night this week so I can even sleep. I was so tired last night because I've slept so little. My knee was aching all night, and I didn't even have the strength to get up and get the ice. And so if I sound a little giddy today, it's because I really didn't sleep all that much. And then my wife, BJ, with knee replacement surgery scheduled in 4 weeks. And I asked her, what's a joint like this doing in a nice girl like you? Well, knees getting weak is what I know about from personal experience. And the main thing I'm learning about bad joints is this, that if you just try to ignore them and just keep doing the same things you always did at the same pace you've always done them, whether it's how hard you work out or how much you try to get done in the yard, or how fast or far you hike up a trail, you will only make it worse. And when it's bone on bone, like with BJ, it's time to make a change and do life differently. And for that, there are a couple of options. I mean, you can lean back in the straddle lounger and never use the joint again. Just admit that you've had your day and your race is over, so you can just quit. Or you can get some help that can rebuild whatever has become weak. Otherwise, if you don't make some kind of a change, then you can pretend everything is fine, just live on extra strength Tylenol and ice packs, but you'd end up crippled. And that's exactly what our writer is thinking about, but on a spiritual level, as he writes verses 12 and 13, grabbing some imagery from Isaiah 35 and Proverbs 4. He's going to talk about weak knees in this race. And so remember, he actually has taken the straddle lounger option off the table. He said, if you're going to run, you're going to have to run with endurance, no quitting. And no avoiding the pain of discipleship, he talks about, because you got a loving Father who has designed all of this to make you a better person. And so you got a race and a training exercise, but now you do have this exhausted runner who's got to keep going, even though he's hitting the wall. You know about the wall. For marathoners are running a wall, you know. One marathoner described hitting the wall this way. He said, there's that place in the race where it feels like a full-sized elephant has just jumped out of a tree and landed on your shoulders and expects you to carry him and his trunk the rest of the way. I love that. Therefore, so here we go. Therefore, lift your drooping hands. Picture an exhausted runner. He's so exhausted his arms drop down. You know, usually when you're running, your arms pumping, keeping the rhythm going. Can't even hold his arms up. The next thing is the knees turn to jello. I remember running the 880 when I was in high school. And the first time I ran it, I ended and I thought my legs had all turned liquid. I wonder if they'd ever solidify again. But it's a terrible feeling. But he says, strengthen your weak knees, your feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet. Don't lose sight of the finish line and get out of the lane or veer off the course so that what is lame may not be put out of joint. That word means dislocated, crippled, permanently disabled, so you can't work or walk anymore, but rather be healed. Now, the first point I want you to think about today is this. You need to do something to strengthen yourself or you're in serious trouble. This dislocation thing. Now, this is an encouragement and a warning. It's encouraging to know that you could actually do something about this weakness. And it's a warning because it tells you that it'll only get worse if you don't make a change. So let's say you're in Rome, you're a Jewish Christian reading this letter when it first arrived, and you're getting more and more pressure to give up on Jesus, and you're worn out by all this. I mean, it's getting old. And you're discouraged. You can't imagine how you will persevere if things heat up any worse. But you just can't do nothing. You have to get in the weight room or the doc's office or something to get stronger, or you're out of the race. Now, verse 13, I'll come in on verse 12 after verse 13, but verse 13 is a take on Proverbs 4:26, where it talks about smoothing or leveling the path for those who are lame. Make straight paths means level paths, which, I mean, this is common image in wisdom writings for choosing a path that lines up with the righteous ways of God. Not swerving to the right or the left, but turning your foot from evil. That's what it says in 4:27. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious what the image means. If you insist on swerving onto rough ground where the devil has planted most of his landmines, don't be surprised if you end up in a spiritual wheelchair. Now, verse 12 draws from Isaiah 35. And we could go back and read these in detail, but that one is a prophetic message that was written to disheartened exiled Jews to encourage them with the prospect that someday they're going to leap like deer and travel in triumph down the highway of holiness. But that's coming off in the future somewhere, and now you're discouraged and you wonder if that'll ever happen. So I guess when you're dodging down a gauntlet of persecution, you could get a lot of strength out of the hope that God is going to make everything right. And he's doing something here that gets you to the end of the race. Now, our writer is not convinced we've got the point yet, so he extends the metaphor of running the good race and fighting the good fight, and says simply, strive for, which means fervently run after, peace with everyone, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. This is verse 14. I'm going to comment later on this because this sounds like, oh, you've got to do all of this in order to have God want to let you see him, like you earn this somehow. We'll come back to that. Now, this is about destination, kind of the reason for the race. The goal line of this race is not just to get into shape for the sake of something else. I think of the first guy to ever run a marathon. I don't know if any of you knew him personally. I don't think so. 2,500 years ago, his name was Phidippides, which I haven't seen in the nursery yet. You know, we have a lot of creative names, but that one, no one picked up on yet. But anyway, he was a Greek soldier. He fought in the battle against the Persians. When the battle was over, he was sent from the battlefield in Marathon to bring news to worried Athens, which was supposedly 26 miles and how many yards? 265 yards. I don't know what it is. Anyway, the distance of the marathon. And it is said that this exhausted soldier ran the entire distance without stopping and burst into the assembly shouting, "Nenekekamen," which means we have conquered. And then, according to the legend of it at least, he collapsed and died. Well, my point is simply that his run had a purpose beyond self-glory or a gold medal. Now, most joggers that I know, I think Nate could testify to this, they aren't actually trying to get anywhere. Right? They run around with the kind of the dubious goal of getting back where they started. And that would be a triumph, especially if you can't remember where you parked your car. But this usually does not involve bursting through the door all sweaty and announcing to your roommate, "Nenekekamen!" Well, we learn in verse 14 that we're supposed to be striving for something. We got a goal here. And that the destination of faith's race, well, two things. They're more tightly connected than you would imagine, but they are peace and holiness. Strive after, pursue, and keep pursuing, running after peace and holiness. Peace. Now, that word may imply that you're in a battle with enemies, but unlike other battles, the goal of the Christian is not to trounce the people that are trying to trip you up. The correct Christian response to opposition has never been to pound, but to persuade. So it says pursue peace with everybody. That might mean doing the best you can to try to get along with all people, Christians or not. We have that kind of command in Romans 12. But here's something else. It seems that the best way to translate this command is pursue peace along with everyone. Not peace with everyone, like it's getting along with everyone, but pursue peace along with everyone, which would be your Christian family. This pursuit of peace is a group quest that can't be attained without the help of the whole Christian family. And so we got the picture of the runner as kind of the lone guy out there running the track or running in the fields or trying to get through the woods or whatever. And really the picture that is here is something that is run together in a group where you're helping each other. So even back in verse 12 when it says, lift up the drooping hands, it doesn't actually say your. There's no word your there. Lift up drooping hands. Help out the wobbly knees. Strengthen them. That could be yours first of all, but then the people around you. And so let's say the everybody here is the Christians who've got to cooperate in order for the race to be successfully run. Not fight each other, not compete with each other. More like the race that, maybe you got this vision in your mind. I can never forget hearing this story about a run in the Special Olympics in Seattle several years ago. This picture in my mind of a runner falling down hard on the cinders and all the others turning back as a group and then picking up the fallen one so that they can go on together arm in arm to the finish tape. It's amazing. You don't see races like this normally. That's a picture of the church. The motto of those Olympics was caring is more important than winning. Well, for Christians, caring is winning. I may have told the story before about Hans, a European seminary professor who was devastated by the death of his wife. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, didn't want to leave the house. Out of concern, the seminary president gathered up some of the other professors, 3 of them, and they paid him a visit. And the professor confessed that he was struggling with doubt. I'm no longer able to pray to God, he said. In fact, I am not certain I believe in God. After a moment of silence, the seminary president said, then we will believe for you. We will pray for you. And so those 4 men diligently did that. They continued to meet daily for prayer, asking God to restore the gift of faith to their colleague, their friend. And some months later, as the 4 friends gathered for prayer with Hans, Hans smiled and said, it is no longer necessary for you to pray for me. Today, I would like you to pray with me. With me. And then one more important thing about peace. We need to broaden our view of peace beyond simply getting along with people to something more like the Old Testament idea of peace, of shalom. And we could speak a long time about this, but shalom basically involved life in God's kingdom as it was supposed to be. A kingdom where life is good and equitable and soul-warming and honoring to both God and people, and where all the blessings of the covenant are enjoyed. That's shalom. And so you strive to be an agent of that peace, to push forward the concerns of God's kingdom around you. It could involve evangelism. It could involve feeding people. It could involve medical work. It could involve things that you do in your job to spread the peace of God. And then when you do that, you get great joy because Jesus said, if you're a peacemaker, you're happy. Happy are the peacemakers because they will be called children of God, like father, like sons. And so that's something the whole community pursues together. And I don't think I would exclude the whole community in the next part either, because it says not only peace, but for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. Peace and righteousness so often go together. The kingdom of peace is a kingdom where the righteous, holy heart of God is getting its way. And so he adds this second intertwined target of our striving, the holiness, the sanctification, and the righteous life without which no one will see the Lord. Now, at this point, you got to apply this to something that the whole church is doing together, but it comes down to an individual because he goes from everyone to no one, because he doesn't want any individual to fail in this who professes to know Christ. So he says, you got to have this holiness, or you as an individual will not see the Lord, so that no one will see the Lord. He doesn't want that ever to happen. So here's the second thing. You need to radically refocus your efforts, not on yourself, not on the world, not on building your kingdom, but on peace and on holiness, or you're in serious trouble. And the trouble here is not something like becoming spiritually hobbled for the rest of your life. It's missing out on the greatest thing possible, the thing that apart from radical grace is impossible, seeing the Lord himself. Now, I preached a message on this a few months ago when we were going through the Beatitudes, where it says, blessed are those who are pure in heart, for they will, what? They'll see God. Now, this is an encouragement and a warning as well, an encouragement because evidently it's possible to pursue peace and holiness and end up actually seeing the Lord. But it's a warning because a great number of supposed followers of Jesus will end up never seeing the Lord who said, come to me, because they really have no interest in the peace of God or pursuing the holiness of God. Seeing God is really the goal of the other goals. You work hard at peace because above all else, you want to see God. You work hard at holiness because and that is the peaceful fruit of righteousness, because without it, you don't get to see the amazing God who saved you. This is the great goal of all salvation. I remember, and I was thinking how long ago this was that I heard this story, but I remember it was 50 years ago last month that I heard a blind preacher preach in Des Moines, Iowa, about his desire to see God. And he told a simple story. He told about an Arkansas boy who became crippled and who was sent to the Mayo Clinic for orthopedic surgery. It involved a series of complex operations, took several months and if not over a year. And the surgeon used every available technique to get that boy on his feet again. And at the end, the parents came by train to get their son and take him home. And the boy was brought to meet the train, and for the first time they got to see him take the steps that they had now heard about. And as he walked haltingly to them across the train platform, you can imagine the tears and the laughter, the amazing joy of watching this happen and being united together. And they thought he would be so happy to see them, but he couldn't stop crying. And they're holding him, and they're looking at him, and they ask, well, what's wrong? And he kept saying over and over again simply this: I just want to see that man who made me walk again. I want to see the man who made me walk again. Now that's what you stand to lose if you're casual about pursuing peace and holiness. You will never see God. Now there's a third or else in this passage. Verse 15 is actually an extension of verse 14. It builds on the idea that this race that we're in is a we thing. We're supposed to be looking after each other. See to it, that's plural. But then it moves to something very singular, that no one. Now get this, because I've read this many times with the idea, see to it, and so you're supposed to look to yourself, make sure that you yourself don't fail to obtain the grace of God. But really this is if you translate this correctly, and I'm not sure exactly how to do it, but the word see to it means watch out for as concerned overseers of one another's lives. This is not just making sure that you don't fail. This is making sure that your company of runners all make it to the finish line. And so you're watching each other and you're looking out for each other. See to it that no one, so here's the individual again, being looked after by a spiritual family. And there are three things here that you want to make sure don't happen. That no one fails to obtain the grace of God. Secondly, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. And the third thing, that no one is as sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. And the last verse tells you why that's so bad. Because you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected. For he found no chance to repent, though he sought it, probably referring to the blessing, with tears. Now here's the third thing. You need to rescue those who are skating on thin, ungodly ice, or you're in serious trouble. And again, this is talking about the tragic possibility that some people in the Christian community will be ultimately lost. Now you might wonder why I didn't say, or they're in serious trouble. Where I say you need to rescue those who are skating on thin, ungodly ice, or on ungodly ice, or they're in serious trouble. I was going to do that until I noticed at the end of verse 15, and by it many become defiled. This is something that evidently affects many in the church. Several. A person who is allowed to fall short of God's grace causes trouble by spreading his unbelief, his quitting attitude, like a contamination to other Christians around him, possibly many, and possibly including you. And so I say, well, sin, it can affect a lot of other people. 1 Corinthians 5 talks about it in this way, leaven leavens the whole lump. And so I say, or you're in serious trouble. It's going to affect you. And it's, again, an encouragement and a warning. It implies that you can rescue people. And that's encouraging. It's like the end of, the very end of the book of James. James 5, 19 and 20. My brothers, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone brings him back, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. That's a glorious thing to have done. But these verses here in Hebrews move on with pretty somber notes that ought to shake up every one of us. I don't know if you're going to like this sermon. In some ways, I hope you don't. Don't come up to me afterwards and say, I really enjoyed that today. You're not going to enjoy this. Because this is talking about responsibility for each other's lives. It's not like you can justify a win some, lose some attitude, like a little shrug that comes when you realize a certain percentage of professed believers, known only to God, of course, are not the real thing. They're just tares, worthless weeds, mimicking the genuine wheat. The genuine wheat, like me, oh well. No, even though a lot of that is true, that oh well attitude is despicable. This says, see to it that no one fails. As much as lies within you, you can't just write off somebody because, for one thing, you never know who is real and who isn't. And so you fight for every soul, even people who end up under church discipline. I think about how Paul wrote to Timothy about two guys who had shipwrecked their faith, whom he had handed over to Satan, which is pretty serious church discipline. But he did so with the hope that, quote, they may learn not to blaspheme. Same kind of language in 1 Corinthians 5. The goal of the discipline was, quote, that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. Now, one more text on this, Galatians 6:1. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, what do? Do you toss the bum out? No, he says, you who are spiritual, this is a test of whether or not you're a spiritual person or not, you who are spiritual should restore him, or at least make every effort to restore him, in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Now, what does it mean to fail to obtain the grace of God? It means that the person fails to be saved, because instead of accepting and really living under the kind care of God, he is overcome by worldly concerns and by the desire to avoid the pains of persecution. And so, like the parable of the soils, you have people Jesus talks about who had a profession of faith, some even receiving the word joyfully, but they don't have true faith, because true faith always lasts. And so when trials and distractions come, these people pull away and they quit following the Lord. It's inevitable. It's inevitable that some people in the church will do that. But it shouldn't be because no one cared enough to help them really connect with Christ. Because somebody said, oh, well, win some, lose some. Actually, you could say all ministry is fighting for other people's faith. Just here in Hebrews, we have the command to exhort each other daily so that no one gets hardened by the lies of sin. Or you don't neglect to meet together. Hebrews 10, because why? It takes an encouraging congregation, working together to make sure that our faith does not waver and that we are motivated to show the fruits of faith, which involve showing our love and our good works. And so when you pray for a sister going through trials, part of that prayer is simply asking God to sustain her faith so that she doesn't give up, but in fact grows deeper in trusting God. I'm sure that many of you that prayed for Cheryl Ford prayed that for her, and God answered that prayer for her. Now, our preacher mentions two situations from the Old Testament where someone failed to obtain God's grace. The first is someone called a root of bitterness. This is the end of verse 15. A root of bitterness. Now, that is not, by the way, a resentful attitude that you need to deal with. And believe me, bitter attitudes definitely need to be dealt with. And they do spread in an ugly way from person to person and defile a congregation. But Deuteronomy 29, 18 to 21 is very specific. It's where this whole idea of the root of bitterness comes from. And it is not an attitude. It is a person. And in fact, it can even be a group of people, a clan or family, a tribe. It's someone whose heart turns away from the Lord to go and serve the detestable gods of the surrounding peoples. And so it calls him, it could be a her, a root bearing poisonous or bitter fruit. Contrast the peaceful fruit of righteousness. It can infect or contaminate the people close to them, sort of like a noxious weed in a field can destroy a whole crop. Now, Moses describes such a contagious person as, quote, one who, when he hears the words of this sworn covenant, blesses himself in his heart, saying, I shall be safe, though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart. In other words, I'm okay because God made promises. I'm an Israelite. Even though I want to walk the way I want to walk. I don't want to obey God. What presumptuous. I can break the commandments of God, but God will still be good to me. This is a person who has totally misunderstood the grace of God. And then Moses said, this will lead to the sweeping away of moist and dry alike. What does that mean? I have no idea. I think it maybe means something about the contagion of the poison defiling many, bringing judgment wider than just one person. Like there's a dry field and a moist field, and both of them you wouldn't expect this to be a problem, but it spreads over there too. Well, anyway, the Lord, Moses said, will not be willing to forgive him. And the Lord will single him out from all the tribes of Israel for calamity. Now, it would be hard to find an Old Testament passage that more closely approximates the permanent, irreversible apostasy that we've been warned about in Hebrews throughout, especially Hebrews 6 and Hebrews 10. Don't turn back. Why? You turn back, you will not be restored to repentance. But get this, the passage in Deuteronomy begins by calling on fellow Israelites to make sure this doesn't happen to the people around them. It says, beware lest this happen. Be alert to what's going on here. See to it. Same thing here. Watch out for each other. And watch out for yourself. Unchecked in our sin, we all face the same problem as the dislocated joint. The bad situation has only become worse. And in this case, it has spread its wicked influence over other people. And so if you see someone who is overtaken with an idolatry of some kind, just picking, there could be many, many examples of this, thousands of idols around actually. But maybe it's somebody with a nice hobby that has grown to the place where it dominates their spirit in such a way that their enthusiasm for the Lord and His Word and all of that has decreased, and you can see it. And yet they are oblivious. They think they're okay because they're a church member. I've heard the words of the covenant. Hey, it's time to confront them out of love. And I'm not talking about sending someone a nasty note because they play ping pong with too much enthusiasm. Like the note that I received when I was in seminary from someone who, he observed my competitive attitude, I guess, after chapel. And so this anonymous stuffed shirt, couldn't stand that. Anyway, this has to involve someone they're involved in obvious sin or obvious false doctrine, whose priorities are showing pretty obviously that their heart for God is cooling off. Their pace in the race is getting slower and slower. Now, that wasn't happening when I was playing ping pong. When I pinged and I ponged, I felt God's pleasure. Never mind. But this is where you exhort one another because you see that something's going on in the race. Paul wrote a whole letter to people who are getting sidetracked by works religion, the book of Galatians. And he says in Galatians 5:7, you were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? I notice you're slowing down. Why are you guys limping? So Paul noticed he was overseeing their souls. Now this warning gets even stronger as the preacher brings up the apostasy of Esau in verses 16 and 17. Esau is Jacob's twin brother. I'm not going to tell this whole story, but Esau is one of the saddest studies in the Bible. Sort of like, King Saul is another one, Judas, of course. People who had great privilege and squandered it. And so he says, here's the third thing, that no one is sexually immoral or unholy. Unholy actually means profane, putting little value in the things of God. The ultimate secular mindset, like, hey, this life is the real life, and God's out there somewhere maybe. So he says, I don't want you to be profane like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. See where his priorities were. For you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. Now, two questions always come up whenever people read these verses. I'll address these very quickly. Why does it connect Esau with immoral behavior? Because there's nothing in Genesis about that. Well, it actually doesn't say here specifically that Esau was immoral. If you put a heavy comma after the word sexually immoral, which you're permitted to do. So you have that no one is sexually immoral. He's not talking about Esau yet. Comma, or unholy like Esau. So it's possible to do that. But it's interesting that Jewish writings accused Esau of bad morals because of his marriage to the Hittite wives. In contrast to Jacob, who traveled back up to Uncle Laban to find a suitable wife. Well, he ended up with two, but whatever, Rachel and Leah. Well, at any rate, the emphasis here is on what we actually know. And it's the classic case of irreversible apostasy, that Esau sold his birthright his part in the amazing blessings given to Abraham. In fact, he thought so little of them that he exchanged them for one measly meal, and he was out of the race. Later, he was excluded from the blessing, even though he wept. And that brings up the second question. The other question has to do with whether God treated Esau harshly when Esau seems to have tried to repent but was still rejected. He cried, for crying out loud. Why can't God just say, oh, you're okay? Now here you must remember that tears can come without involving a true change of heart. Remorse, but not repentance. If you've raised children, you know there are different kinds of tears. Worldly sorrow, not godly sorrow. At the time, Esau's heart was still hot to murder his brother. Well, Judas is another example of someone who knows he's done wrong and regrets tearfully the consequences of his choices, but whose heart toward God is unchanged. These men had gone too far, and there was no rescue for them. So the preacher to the Hebrews, he's borne in on the same message now over and over. Don't turn away from God, even when following Jesus is getting hard, because you will just make a bad thing worse. Eternally, mind-blowingly worse. And the point has now been expanded to include the responsibility of all Christians, not only to seek genuine peace and holiness for themselves as they run the race, but to help other Christians do the same. The consequences are just that serious. And if you take consolation that at least you are doing okay and you let others drift into sin without raising an alarm, then you expose other parts of the family to defilement, and many will be lost forever. And don't try to think that that's not applicable right here in this room. If there are people that you know that maybe you should have gone to and you have never done so, who are skating on thin ice, and trouble is coming. Now, I preach this message. I'm not good at this. Not just not at the preaching of it, but the doing of the confrontation, the coming to someone lovingly and gently but pleadingly, that when you see something in their life that's just taking them downhill, that somehow they could do something about it. And now I'm finally ready to talk about the very first word of today's text. But all right, Deuteronomy 29, 18 to 21. I was supposed to put that up there. Okay, here we go. The very first word is therefore. I never like it when somebody preaches a little part of a book and then they don't show how it fits with the rest. And so I'm not going to do that. Therefore, it connects this with the first part of the chapter. Now, this would be quick to explain if you'd all been here the last 2 weeks, but some of you are playing hooky. I know some of you are out, dancing on a boat somewhere. I don't know. But you're back, so this is all good. But today what we have in our passage are the application commands based on a firm belief in what was taught in verses 1 to 11. Now remember what faith involves, sort of the process of it. First, God speaks and you hear him. That's number one. Number two, you believe what he says, that it is true, right, and trustworthy. And then finally, if you really believe it, you will, number three, act on it. Okay, what we get in our verses today are how you act on it. But what we got in verses 1 to 11 is what we're supposed to hear from God and what we're supposed to believe. And that leads us to what we do. So here we go. Now I'm going to give you a very fast review of those first 11 verses in a paraphrase. So I'm going to read them. Listen to me very carefully, because this will be a reliving some of the last two messages, but go back and listen to those messages, by the way, if you haven't. Okay, so here we go. We learned that there's a race we have to run, a race that God has appointed for our life. But because we all enter the race carrying bad baggage, encumbrances that only drag us down, and struggle against sin that will always trip us up if we let it, we will need to develop endurance. We can get that by looking at the lives of faithful people who lived in the past or even in the present, but mostly and supremely by turning our eyes on Jesus, who endured the worst of all possible things, a cross, and did so trusting in God, and has actually finished the race and is sitting right now at the right hand of God's throne. All of this proves that the life of faith is possible. at least if we have his help. He is the inventor and perfecter of faith. And it also proves that the outcome of faith is wonderful, that it's impossible to give up more than what you gain. Think of Jesus dying on the cross, but ending up on a throne. And so when you are exhausted and you are near to collapse, just look at Jesus and consider the extreme hostility that he faced. And realize one good thing, you haven't had to go that far yet. At least if you're reading this, you're obviously not dead. So also his enemies are your enemies, and he will help you fight in this fight. And look, even though you may sometimes think God is uncaring and remote when he lets you suffer, it's not true. You're not his enemies. You're God's dear sons and daughters, and he's training you to trust him and to develop the life skills necessary for running with endurance. Unfortunately, because of our stubbornness, suffering will be part of that training. But look, the silver lining is that discipline or training like this is actually proof that God accepts you as a son and takes responsibility for your upbringing and your success in this race of life. In his loving wisdom, he knows how to prepare you for life. This is not punishment, and it is not meaningless. The Father does this for our good, that we might share his holiness. And sure, at the time it feels like a bad thing, but it's not, because if you let it put you through the paces, it produces in time something very pleasant and beautiful, the peaceful fruit that is righteousness. And you can resent how hard this race is, but it is actually a gift of love that can be counted on to build a strong, sweet relationship with God himself. Therefore, what are you supposed to do with all that? If that's true and you believe it, God spoke it, you said, okay, Jesus, God, his attitudes, what he has done, all of that. Now what's next? What does this look like in my life? Now I've got three things among many that we could glean from this chapter, and they connect with the 3 points that we've already gone through from the passage. But here's the first one. One, if it's true that this race course is brutal at times, but has been custom designed for you by a loving Father for your good, that God is not looking on passively while you get drilled, but is purposely operating on your heart to make you holy. If you truly believe that, then therefore, renew your strength. Renew your strength. Don't be discouraged. You don't quit. You strengthen your droopy hands. You do something about your feeble knees. You make straight, level paths for your feet. Knowing that God loves you and doesn't hate you, you know he would never assign you a course that's too much for you. At least not too much if you run it with him. And you realize God is for you. That is one of the most amazing statements you can make. How many people in this world do not know that God is for you? God is teaching you to walk so that you can run like the wind. Now, you've watched your children or your grandchildren learn to walk, and they're very proud. Most recently, one of my kids will bring their little guy over, and they're very proud to show off this new skill. It's magnificent to see them ambulatory while we scurry around kid-proofing the room. But anyway, here are some little tips about how learning to walk works. If the little guy walks 3 steps, he gets placed a little farther from the coffee table to see if he'll be able to do 4 steps. And if he can do 4, you see if he can do 5. Why? Because 4 steps is wonderful, but it is not enough if he's going to become a man. And so you stretch the little guy, not because you're cruel, but because you're kind. It's hard to tell the difference because, sometimes God blesses you in ways that look like he's trying to kill you. But if you understand and believe all of this, you don't demand God fix all your problems so you can have an easier race, but you trust him. That there is no trial that he allows that is not common to man, but that he is faithful not to allow you to be tested beyond what you're able, but will with the trial also make a way of escape so that you might be able to endure it. I'm quoting from 1 Corinthians 10:13. Most of you memorize that with the translation temptation. There's no temptation, but it's the same word. Trial or temptation. And so you say, God, you are for me. You don't assign me something, and so you get strength from that. But if you have a wrong idea about God's heart when you suffer, then things are only going to get worse. Now here's number 2. if it's true that the creative, loving, sovereign Father is constantly at work for your growth in his righteousness so that you can share his holiness, even as he trains you with hardship, if you really believe that, do you? Well then, therefore, you refocus on the things that lead to seeing this amazing, loving Father who, in fact, sits on a throne, the one who made you walk again. But not as a way of earning it. And that's the main thing I want to bring out here. Because all that you are doing and producing and pursuing peace and holiness is doing what God is already putting in your heart. Because he is doing for you, in you, around you, whatever will lead you to the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Peaceful, there's peace. Righteousness, there's holiness. And so all of your efforts are rooted in the things God is already doing for you and in you. You are not commanded to do these things, in fact, in order to get God to adopt you. But you do them based on the fact that you already are his child by grace. And so this is living out your sonship. Son of a Father who also makes peace and loves righteousness. As John Piper puts it, we are commanded to act like people who are utterly persuaded that we are already adopted by faith and that our omnipotent Father loves us and that the most painful adversities of your lives are expressions of his loving discipline and not his hateful vengeance. And so then you work out what God is working in. And that's why verse 14 is not works religion. It's not like you can build up enough peace and holiness to get a chance to see God anyway. This effort flows out of God's deep gift of peace and holiness to you through the cross. And so it's grace to you. And you trust God for it all, and that's the only way you can live it. And so, you can misunderstand God if you want to, but if you got the wrong idea, like somehow it's all up to you, that you've got to earn your sonship, that you've got to find a way to make it all happen, then things are only going to get way worse because you will not see the Lord if it's up to you. And here's number 3. If it's true that there's a whole family of sons and daughters in this race with diverse assignments and of hardship, but all of them are carrying encumbrances and battling various sins, and it's God's grace for each of them to learn endurance and obedience through what they suffer, not just you. If you truly believe that, then therefore, you are not casual about your brothers and sisters because God isn't. You don't want any of them to miss the grace of God. You don't want any of them to trade in the growing pains of God's loving discipline for the delights of this world, like Esau did, who sold his birthright for a single meal. Therefore, you get out of yourself, you look around at the other runners, and you find out who needs some help and encouragement, who's limping, struggling, slipping, gasping, who seems unconcerned about either peace or holiness. They're off into some personal, selfish agenda, who is dabbling in some idolatry, like a root of bitterness, who is making immoral choices in the sexual area, who, like Esau, is being captured by temporary pleasures that show they are putting a low value on eternal things. Do you know any Christian like any of those that you have not gone to humbly and pleadingly? Someone that you maybe knew you needed to go to for a very long time, but you chickened out. Maybe a face comes to mind. And in the spirit of Galatians 6:1, gently considering yourself lest you be tempted in the same way. It could easily have been you. Is there an adult, a child, a relative, a teenager, a college student that needs a word from you? I can say that if I have a wrong idea about the love of the Father for all his kids, then I won't do anything to help them. And then the troubles in the church will only get worse. And if we apply to the church the world's idea that everyone is free to be messed up the way they want to and don't interfere, don't just leave people alone, then the troubles of the church will only get worse. But what if we really believed all this and we started helping each other the way we should? Not intrusively, but compassionately and patiently. What would the race look like then? Charlie Engle, Ray Zahab, and Kevin Lynn know endurance better than most. For 111 days, they ran the equivalent of 2 marathons a day. 111 days in order to cross the entire Sahara Desert on foot. Who thinks of doing something like that? Well, they touched the waters in Senegal, and then they made their way through Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Libya, and Egypt, finally, to touch the waters of the Red Sea. And along the way, the trio faced hazards. You can just imagine what it was like. Temperatures of 100 degrees like we're going to have, I hear, on Thursday coming up. Don't go out and do a marathon on Thursday. Anyway, but they also had jarring, freezing nights and sandstorms and tendinitis and even violent sickness, and then the usual aches, pains, and blisters. But the biggest challenge they faced was just getting water, finding a place that was good living water that could sustain them. Finding it in its purest, cleanest form gets to be a bit of a chore when you're in the middle of nowhere. Well, crossing the Sahara on foot is an amazing accomplishment. But even more amazing and commendable are these marathon finishers. Christians who finish their lives still growing, still serving. Husbands and wives who stay faithful to each other until death do us part. Young people who persevere in their virginity until marriage in spite of crushing peer pressure. And people who pick up after failure with a renewed commitment to Christ and to serving others and to purity. And pastors who stay passionate about ministry until their last breath. Church members who weather the rough patches and remain joyful and faithful and loving, tender-hearted. And the deal is, you don't run the race that well without a lot of help. Who is weak and needs a word from you? Do we care enough to even notice? Who do you know who needs a cup of living water? Let's pray. Our Lord in glory, we have a hard enough time just even looking at our own soul, trying to keep track of ourselves. Some of us don't even want to look inside and see what's there, let alone hearing that we have a responsibility for each other. But this is what we've been called to today. So as we join our hearts to worship you, we know that you are a God with a large family, and that you are lovingly shepherding the lives of all your people. Use us any way you want to bless, encourage, exhort, help each other on the way. Maybe we be like those Special Olympic kids that didn't put finishing the race by themselves as any kind of great goal, but united together to help each other. When one falls, it hurts us all. So give us strength to run the race. In Jesus' name.